Okay, hello and welcome to today's episode of Shaping EDU Live, all about the teaching toolset triangle. I'm going to turn it over to Mayor Tom Haynes in just a moment, but first, for those of you who are joining Shaping EDU for the first time, a little bit about us. So Shaping EDU is a community of dreamer doer drivers from around the world, and together we're trying to make actionable progress, concrete progress, on our 10 founding actions. So these are our 10 actions to shape the future of learning in the digital age. We collaborate asynchronously and synchronously through a series of online events such as this one. We have a Slack community where our ongoing conversations take place. And for the first time, we will be hosting a summer camp. So Learning Man is taking place at the end of July, July 20th through 27th. And it's a week-long series of events and opportunities for creative play and collaboration, all around pushing the envelope for how we serve students and enable learner success. So it's free to join. Again, taking place at the end of July. There's a link here on the screen for more information. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom.
Okay, hello everyone. So I'm going to endeavor to keep the chat room up and running on the side so that I can, so you can see what's going on, or I can see what's going on there as far as if anybody has questions, but feel free to sing out. My name is Tom Haynes. I'm the mayor of the Humanizing Learning neighborhood here at Shaping EDU. It's always been a little bit amorphous as to what that actually means, and different people have different views of what that actually means. But to me, it's really about developing and creating human-centered technology and systems around learning. You know, it's not just tools. You know, we think of technology as being dehumanizing, and the actuality is that it can be used as a force for really humanizing learning. One of the problems and one of the struggles with learning and education as we, you know, currently experience it on a day-to-day basis is that, you know, education is still very much run on an industrial model and producing widgets of people being spit out the other side. And a lot of that is due to the technology limitations that existed, you know, until fairly recently. And so one of the things that I have made a real centerpiece of the effort of that neighborhood is to think about ways in which that technology can be used to build out from the human rather than to build down to the human. And so that's really what a lot of today's talk both comes from and is hopefully continuing to lead to moving forward. My background, I've been in technology. Well, my first computer was an Apple II Plus in 1981, so you have some sense of how long I've been playing with these toys. I do a fair amount of photography, not as much lately, but I need to get back into that. I've been a member of this community since the beginning, and before that, the new media community going back to the early 2000s. But I'm, you know, I consider myself a technologist, but I also absolutely can start from the perspective of as I'm a teacher as well. And my job is either teaching or it's helping people teach. And one way or the other, the idea is to, again, recenter the conversation around what the student needs, what the individual needs in their learning journeys, because everybody has to experience that on their own. And so there's a whole other side of stuff that I work on that has everything to do with technology and has nothing to do with technology at the same time. And so that's sort of a little bit of background on me. I have a book coming out in the fall called Discovering Digital Humanity, of which I know at least one of you has read, 1.5 of you actually. And thank you for the help with the review on that. And so, but that will be coming out in the fall. And a lot of the work that's related to this is also contained in that book, but the idea being basically that again, we need to use technology to be better humans, not to allow it to dehumanize us, as we often see. I describe the book as a relationship manual for people with technology. So, without further ado, though, let me get into the purpose of the workshop today and talk a little bit about how we're going to do that. First of all, I want to give you a little bit of introduction and background on where it comes from, and I'll give you a quick tour of the website. There's several pages about this with some, more detailed background information. I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but I do feel like we need to get some basic, some foundation work before we get into the survey. But I do want to spend the largest chunk of the day going through this Toolset survey that I've been working on for about 6 months now. Well, before I don't want to steal my own thunder, let me go and switch on my quick intro prezzo, which should go for about 15 minutes. And I also have to remember, when you share screens with Zoom, to always pull the chat room out. There we go. At least you can do that with Zoom. As I was commenting to Laura before the show, that there's some of these video conferencing platforms, when you share a screen, you lose the chat. So yeah, if you have questions or otherwise, you can throw them in the chat or unmute yourself, and feel free as we go through here. Okay, so the teaching toolset triangle. So what I'm trying to do here is to really deconstruct both the teaching side of the equation as well as the tools that we have available to us. And one of the things that I think we kind of lose sight of as we're working through these things is that this world has changed a lot, and yet we haven't really thought through the implications of some of these changes. I mean, there have been things here and there, but there's not really a systematic attempt to see, okay, how do these tools specifically affect how we teach? And I mean, 30, 40 years ago, this was a pretty easy conversation to have. It was all about, you had a classroom with furniture in it and a board up in front, whiteboard or Blackboard, and that was pretty much your teaching tool set. I mean, that's what you had. You might have a film strip projector or an overhead projector, but those are fairly limited tools, and that really affected how you could teach in many ways, in a real and physical way. And of course, that started to shift as we started getting projectors and the internet and other sorts of things put in the rooms. But over the last 25 years, we've seen an explosion of tools that are available to us, both online as well as in person, that can affect that have a real effect on how and why we can teach. And I also take a very expansive view of what a tool set is. So on one level, on a very basic level, a tool can be something that you would think of as a tool, like a projector or a whiteboard or something like that. But on a larger level, how we teach, the strategies we use, the pedagogical strategies, those are also tools. And so that there's not one way to teach. And we all practice a wide variety of strategies in the classroom. And last but not least, although I'm not really going to cover this too much, but I certainly have been working on it in another context, is there are systems built on top of how we expect to teach and how the tools limit how we manage our students, such as course schedules and sections and all of that sort of stuff, which the tools have started, theoretically could disrupt that too. I recently wrote a piece for eCampus, which actually isn't out yet. It should be out in a few weeks, but where I talk about, why do we have sections in online learning? Why don't we rethink that whole thing? Because a section is really about putting students into a room. You have 30 seats. and the room's so big, and you got to put so many students in and get them through in the course of a daily schedule. I mean, it's based on a physical object, the classroom. So by changing the context of that, you can change the conversation around that too. But that's a larger thing. But all of these things, again, are kind of a buildup. So, one of the things that I've noticed in a lot of people's responses to COVID and how are we going to manage the fall is they do tend to be all or nothing. People talk about we're going to have online education, or we're going to have in-person education, or we're going to have hybrid, which is online plus in-person. And they don't really think about some of the possibilities that explode those boxes. There's some things that work better online. There's some things that work better in person. It's not inherently inferior or on either side. But what it boils down to is which tools do you have and how do you use those tools? How can you break that apart? And so, again, getting back to this idea, we really need to start understanding those tools and how they shape what we do. The other thing to remember is that, from the perspective of the student, it's a holistic experience. I mean, they don't think about your classroom in the context of what's on the what kind of chairs you have, or whether you have a whiteboard or a Blackboard or a projector, or whether you can move things around or whatever. They don't think about it in those terms. They think about it as, okay, what's happening to me in this room? What is that experience, that learning experience? How does that relate to the textbook we're using? How does that relate to the online work that we're doing? I mean, all of these things fall into one whole experience for the student over the course of the semester. How does your personality play through that, right? The last but not least, we don't tend to be very critical of those tools. We tend to accept them as they are. One of the things that has been my eternal frustration with a lot of computing technology is these things are infinitely malleable, and yet we insist on building them in ways that frustrate the heck out of people. And, I'm very impatient with software that doesn't work right, or tool systems that make my life harder. Because I'm like, that's not the point. That's not why we're doing this, right? So, yes, Steve, I understand that. Yeah, well, that's a side. I'm looking at your sections comment. Yes, that's I agree, but that's a longer side conversation. I don't want to go too far off on the sections thing. Okay, so. So I just got through saying tools, we need to think of tools separately. But we need to recognize that at one level, they're very simple, and at other levels, they can be very complex. And how we construct our environments can either be fragile or, in the words of Nicholas Taleb, anti-fragile. And anti-fragile doesn't just mean resilient, it means that we thrive under adverse conditions. And so, you can build, the problem with fixed schedules and sections and things like that is they introduce a certain rigidity to the system. And if that system gets disrupted by an unexpected shutdown of the campus, your ability to respond to that is maybe not completely dead, but it's at a certain level compromised. I think our inability to, for instance, adjust the way the semester works this spring had a lot to do with the kind of solutions and the quality of the output. There were a lot of people who were talking early on, we should just shut down for a month and then go into the summer. And there's obviously business reasons around why not to do that. But the point is that was a structural system response that we chose not to make. And that was, that's arguably that tool of the semester. Again, then we're talking about a systemic tool there. Didn't allow for that level of anti-fragility. MacGyver, in my opinion, is the master of anti-fragility, and he was a master of his toolbox, because he could look at a stick of gum and go, okay, this is what I can do to solve this problem. I think that's a good way to think about this and say, okay, well, let's look at the toolboxes we have and then start to think upward from those tools toward the solution, rather than saying, okay, we're going to set up a solution this way and then we're going to try to find the tools that are going to get us there. That's, that's, I think, one difference in the way I'm approaching this and the way I've seen a lot of other folks approach this. And then the other thing is, think of tools as Legos. I played a lot when I was a kid with the basic Lego set. We didn't have all these fancy kits back in the old days with our stone tablets and whatnot. But the basic, you could make the most amazing things out of the basic Lego kit. And I got really good at adapting, and saying, okay, won't let me do this, but I can still make a house. I can still make a car. I can still make these sorts of things out of it and I can make a really cool looking thing and has this sort of thing on it and so on and so forth. We need to go back to that. We need to fall back to that and think about what are the Legos in our box and how can we put them together in creative ways. And so the first thing that we need to do is to back up and walk and take a step away from the technology and look at teaching itself as a toolbox. So there's 3 parts to this triangle. The first part is pedagogy or teaching. The first T is teaching. Thanks to Ruben Puentedura, who's with us today. I was introduced several years ago to the work of Diana Laurillard. And the thing I really like about the way she talks about teaching is that she treats it like it's a toolbox. She takes it all apart and looks at all of these different interactions that happen over the course of a teaching block, whatever that may be, a class, semester, whatever, lesson. And she deconstructs all of these things and talks about how teachers interact with the students interact with each other, but also there's an important part of this about the students' internal conversations. In some ways, that's the most important conversation you can have in a class, but that's, again, a topic for another day. But one of the cool things about Laurillard's conversational frameworks is that they can be used to look at different teaching strategies. So for instance, one that she looks at, and she has 4 of them, and I'll go through them briefly in a little bit, but just to sort of introduce you to the idea. So Instructionism is in many ways a very traditional teaching method. Most of the interactions in this approach come between the teacher and the student. It can be as simple as something like a lecture method, where you're talking at the student, you give them a test to see how they're doing, and you give them feedback on the test and rinse and repeat. But most of this is a very teacher-centered approach to teaching. And the primary role of that communication between the student and the teacher is that feedback of, okay, are you getting it? And that's called Instructionism. And you can see that method kind of only hits half of this conversational framework. And that impacts, those conversations are different than in the other teaching methods. So you can use these frameworks by breaking them out. So this is the instructional method. Now, I realize this is very small. I'm not expecting you to read this. And I also want to point out that this is my rough draft attempt to do what we're trying to do today. But the idea here is, okay, if you want to teach using an instructionalist model, what kind of tools are best suited to support that kind of teaching out of all of the tools that we have now? And there are 3 big groups of tool sets that I identify. And I've not completely settled on the names, to be frank, because there's different ways of describing the same thing. Digital tool sets, so proximate tool sets / physical tool sets, the one on the bottom is where most people usually start. This is the physical space of the classroom itself. And the key characteristics of that are that the participants are all in the same place at the same time. And that brings with it many benefits of immediate feedback, et cetera, but it also has a certain ephemeral nature unless you somehow figure out a way to record it, which has its challenges. And so as a result, it's very much a performance art in some ways. But those are the characteristics of proximate tool sets. Or you could call them, I also sometimes call them physical tool sets. And then on the other end of the spectrum are the digital tool sets or virtual tool sets. Now, the problem with calling them virtual tool sets is there's a third category, which I'll touch on in just a minute, that also uses virtual. But has somewhat different characteristics. The digital tool sets are the ones we're kind of used to in many ways, that we've been using for 20 years now or more. Things like learning management systems, web pages, et cetera, et cetera. And they carry with them the advantage of separating the user or the experience from the requirements of distance and time. So they tend to be persistent in nature. So you put something up, you can still see it a week later. And they tend to be and you don't have to be in the same place as the person communicating in order to get the message. So that's the digital tool sets. Asynchronicity is a key factor there. And there's a new tool set that's emerging on the horizon, and I know we have a working group here at ShapingEDU that's directly focused on this idea of XR. And one of the things about XR that's really fascinating, if you look at it from a thought experiment, is in some ways it combines both the persistence of the digital tool sets and the immediacy of the proximate tool sets. Right now, we just simply don't have enough depth of experience with many of these tools to really get a feel for how they're going to reshape what we're doing. There's still some technology barriers involved, and of course, and one of the things that tends to dominate the space right now is created environments that the student and or the teacher experience rather than deeply interact with. And again, there are lots of experiments going on, but it's really not a wide enough thing. But I do need to recognize those because that's coming. And so they're in the survey, but they're treated a little differently than the other two tool sets. So where does this all hang together? This is kind of my concept map. As I started thinking through, Laura encouraged me to do this, but starting thinking through, okay, how do these things all play out with the work that I've been doing for the last almost decade now? This idea again of the human over the tool is also central to the idea spaces framework. The empowered student, which grows out of the Laurel Ard, and again feeds into the book. But the immediate impetus in front of this effort was some work I'm doing with Houston Community College in designing a new campus out here in Katy, Texas. And one of the things that we were trying to do with this campus is to optimize it for hybrid education. And so I was tasked with trying to figure out what exactly does a campus optimized for hybrid look like. And I started thinking these things through. And initially I was looking at the informal learning spaces because I recognized that in a hybrid environment where if you think of a class as an online first class supplemented by a physical environment, those informal spaces are very important because they theoretically give a student kind of a home base to come into, get support, work with other students, et cetera, et cetera. And so that led to the stack model. And there's an article on that actually appearing, a little plug for another thing that ShapingEDU is doing. What is that, a week from now, I think, Sam, 18th? The new edition of Current Issues in Education, our special edition, there's an article on the stack model in that. The other thing that led to, though, is I started thinking about it more generally in thinking about the classroom spaces and the online spaces that have to complement that, is this idea of the teaching toolset triangle, the idea that of really doing a real investigation and thinking about where these tools should be, how they should be employed. So as I was beginning to work on this weird state we've become involved in now, this pandemic environment, suddenly hit home. And as I was talking to the president of Northwest College, Zach Hodges, one day, it suddenly clicked in my head. I said, you know, hybrid is a way that you can either use hybrid to get more students into a campus, but you can also use hybrid to get less students into a campus. So how do we rethink hybrid in a way that gets us in the fall to an environment where we're putting less pressure on physical facilities and making it less pressure for a certain number of students to be on campus at a certain time, making it easier to manage both the cleanliness and other housekeeping kind of things that are involved with keeping a campus safe in this environment, but also the human can't pack too many sardines in the can kind of problem. So those all kind of came together. The other thing that came out of it was that the in-person ethnographic interviews I was going to do for this campus kind of fell apart because everybody, A, went into panic mode, and B, I couldn't, you know, it was harder to sit down with people and have these kind of conversations. So the idea of doing this as a much broader survey started to emerge. And so that's where the T3 survey comes from. Where are we going with this? And I'll come back around to this at the end, but there's several things that are already starting to grow out of this. Again, I've kind of been playing around with some ideas for the fall, which I call Hybrid Plus. A little further down the road, another article that I'm working on for ShapingEDU is on a tool-driven achievement system where we can do a better job of communicating achievement than transcripts and things like that. So, and I've done some thought around that as well. That's a little more amorphous at this point. But specifically, what we're looking at here as part of the project is that as we collect survey information from this survey, to do some analysis on the data, and see where that goes. So, you know, we certainly see some papers and presentations coming out of it. But one of the things that could be a real tangible product that we could produce based on people's feedback is sort of a guidebook that we could then distribute to the membership or to the world at large around these tool sets. And so if you want to use these tool sets, what kind of teaching, you know, if you want to do this kind of teaching, what kind of tool sets are most helpful in putting those things together, and how do you put that together? So that's sort of where we're going with all of this. So yes, Sam just put in the chat room, first installment launching 6/18. So this is a good time to do a quick pause because I am going to flip screens here and go to the website. The URL for the website is it's on my space on my website, and we'll put it. I think we can share a link to this out through ShapingEDU channels as well. It's ideaspaces.net/toolsets. And so I'm going to. I don't think am I such a total Zoom newbie? I'm not a Zoom newbie, but am I such a total Zoom amateur that I haven't figured out you can't flip when you're doing a screen share, you can't flip from one app to another unless you do a full desktop share, I guess. But so stop it and then start it again. Okay, pull up the chat room. So anybody, real quick, questions, thoughts before we go on any further? Okay, so so this is the Idea Spaces page. Sorry, go ahead.
This is Dale Johnson. I work at
Arizona. Hey, Dale.
State in the University Design Institute. And I like the idea of the hybrid model. I think that as we think about the future normal, there's some version of that. So as you develop more materials, I'd love to see those in the future. Yeah,
there was an article. I had an article published Tuesday. Yeah, I think it was Tuesday, the 9th, on eCampus News. I think it's still up on their homepage on sort of my initial thinking around the Hybrid Plus model, based on thinking about this in the problem in this context. Yeah, I know hybrid is in my mind the future, honestly, because what that means, I think, is going to shift over time. I think the distinction needs to also be about not so much physical versus online. I think the key distinction is synchronous versus asynchronous, and how those things mix. You should be able to mix those within a course, because one of the things that I have. I teach at a community college. I will freely admit that most of the students, the problems that my students have are not from lack of intelligence, they are from lack of learning skills. And those come out in a myriad of different ways. And one of the reasons that I kind of walked away a bit from distance ed a number of years ago was because I discovered that if I wanted to maintain standards in the course, it was just too hard with that level of students, that it was just, I couldn't quite get that connection to work. And so I figured I started moving more to a hybrid model, to where I can do that hands-on experience and interaction with the students, which is often very important and hard to achieve online. So, and I know there's a lot of things, there's a lot of things that there's a lot of things that you can do online that help with that, but there's always going to be a certain amount of distance placed between you and the student on technology. So Jay, it's the triangle is technology, the two different technology types, the digital and the proximate, okay, and then the pedagogical side of things. So, and I'll show you that. That's also on here as well. So a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about is here in text form. So if you want to go back and read some of the background and some of the ways that, thinking about these things, that's all here. And here's an example of the triangle. And this is where the concept comes from. It's not a mnemonic, so there's not 3 T's in it. It's teaching toolset triangle. Those are the 3 T's. I know the triangle is one of the T's, but that's cheating. I get that. But yeah, it's the pedagogical tool sets, the digital tool sets, and the proximate tool sets. And with the addition of XR, I think it becomes, Laura and I were discussing this yesterday. I think it's a rhombus, a 4-sided triangle with a third part here. Although the other way to think about it is that if you think about as this evolves, thinking about synchronous versus asynchronous tool sets, and that XR would then split into the other 2 things, and you still have a triangle. So we'll see. I think we're about 3 to 5 years away from actually making that determination. So. There are 3 subpages here on this site, and it's kind of set up a little bit like a course, in the sense that so it's set up a little bit like a course, in the sense that you start with hierarchies of conversation. So this goes through the breakdown that Diana Laurillard, she wrote an article about this in 2009, and that's where these diagrams come from. But how she breaks, there's more to the article than that, but I really liked, I really like how she again shows how those different instructional approaches affect those conversational intersections. So again, here's instructionism. We've already talked about that. Then there's constructionism, which primarily comes from Seymour Popper and Edith Harrell. And the logo work going back to the 1960s. And it's very much the idea that the students generate their own learning internal to themselves, and the teacher's just sort of there in the background in many ways, as the students work their way through constructing their learning environments. In the act of constructing their learning environments, they're learning how to do those things, right? So that's constructionism. And Reubens probably tearing his hair out as I butcher this stuff. But he's got plenty of hair to tear out, so we're good. And then there's the socio-cultural model. And the idea there is that it's not just the students themselves, but also their peers that interaction between student and peer that is the key at helping the students across those barriers. And the teacher sort of throws challenges into the group and then lets the group stew on that. But it's very much that group approach to learning, illustrated most clearly or most directly by the work of Vygotsky, and moving beyond him. And there's been a lot of work since then. And if you want, Ruben can obviously give you a whole literature on all of these things too. And then last but not least, the collaborative learning, which kind of combines the sociocultural learning and the constructivist approach, in that you have the students self-construct the knowledge, but they're also then working with a group. And again, it's sort of, instead of that, and it's a very practical bottom-up approach to teaching and learning, and then the students are working in groups, and that's called collaborative learning. So it kind of puts those two together. To pull off it, now a good teacher, by the way, uses all of these methods at various points in time in class. I mean, there are advantages to each approach. But it's helpful as you're going through and thinking reflectively about how you're acting in class and the kind of things you're trying to achieve in class, if you then have sets of tools that complement what you're trying to do. So you can, as you think about these tool sets, you can think about a classroom and analyze the different tools that are in there and say, oh, okay, this is going to help me here, this is going to help me there. This is sort of the introduction to this is sort of the overview thing. But I mean, you can look at an existing classroom and use this as a tool of analysis. And so here's some rooms that I've had some hand in at various times and places over the years. By the way, and you can also use this to analyze online environments, including Zoom. And one of the things that has really struck me over the last few weeks, which, it's one of those things you think but is that video conferencing spaces are like virtual classrooms. And they have the same kind of pros and cons, pluses and minuses that a physical room will have in terms of how they lay things out. I was mentioning before that in certain platforms you can't see the chat room when you're sharing, which conveys a message to the teacher that what's going on in the chat room is A, not important, and that B, what they have on the screen is the most important thing in the room. So that's, kind of pushes you more in an instructivist way. One of the reasons I like about Zoom is it's much flatter in many ways. And so I think it facilitates conversation more, just from its UI, user interface. One of the other things I found that's really kind of nice with some of the more advanced versions of Zoom, I don't know how widespread this is. I think it's the web. I use just the pro version because I'm not going to pay $50 a month for the webinar platform, whatever it's called, the next level up. But who was it? The Chronicle. Actually, Brian just joined us, and I know he's done some sessions with the Chronicle. I think it's really cool that on that version of Zoom, you can have a Q&A chat as well as the regular chat. And I think that that's really good for the presenter, because then you can have side conversations in a chat that you would have in a regular conference or even in a classroom. You could have those side conversations that, maybe the presenter wants to take a note of, but maybe not. But then you also want to be able to have a question space, right? And so having that second Q&A, essentially chat, is a really good feature. Shindig does that as well. and they separate those two out, although it's a little more blocked out. But again, you can analyze all of these different kinds of tools in this way. So I had a question: collaborative learning, pretty much the same as connectivist learning. I think connectivist learning is more constructivist learning. I think it's closer to that. Ruben, you can correct me on that. I've forgotten. One of the problems with our field is that there's too much jargonism sometimes. That knowing which version of which is, and depending on the context. So. And I know some of these are more defined than others. Okay, so and I go through again these characteristics of the different spaces, blah blah blah, and then last but not least, this will take you to the survey. So this kind of puts it all together and explains these are the instructions, the basic instructions for the survey, which are repeated on the survey. Now I may foreground the survey on this page. One of the reasons I haven't done this yet. And this is a Google form. So I may foreground the link to this. I haven't done this yet because up until about a week ago it was still somewhat drafty in form. So the survey has multiple layers to it. One is a data collection layer. Now, I am a social scientist, and I realize that I'm not likely to get enough response on the numerical categories to get what would be considered a meaningful sample size. What I'm instead looking at achieving there is is a scatter diagram, in a sense of getting a heat map more than anything else. But I'm very cognizant of biases and ways in which data can be manipulated. To me, in some ways, the qualitative aspect of this is at least or even more important than any sort of a idea that I'll somehow get a quantitative set of answers out of this. I mean, again, I'm very sensitive to the limitations of that sort of thing, and I can't tell you how many educational studies I've seen that have predicted this wonderful result, and then I look at their sample size and it's 30 students. I'm like, yeah, you know what? I don't think so, and so this is hard to do. I am a one-man show, and I get a little help from my friends. But at the end of the day, I do not have the reach to do this. So, in some ways, okay. So I'm asking everybody to go ahead and put their email address in here. So I'm going to put my Idea Spaces address on this one. And the reason for this is not because I particularly want to spy on you, but part of this is. This is a conversation. The qualitative parts of this, I want to be a conversation. So I want people to talk here today. This is meant to be an interactive session. I'd like you to be going through this that we all do this as a group. I can do this with groups as well, other groups as well, and have these conversations. But these things all have to be experienced in your environments. There's no one way to do this. And that's sort of the idea here, is that in a digital world, customization is inherently possible. And as long as we are prepared to grasp that, then it really opens up a lot of possibilities. And the more we close things down, the analog world, the industrial world was fairly constrained because the tech was hard. And now a lot of tech is easy, So I can't see your screens, but I want to go through this and see if people have comments. Feel free to unmute and talk as we go through. Also questions about what I've said. And so the first section here are the, looking at the physical tools, the proximate tools. And again, here's some basic characteristics of those kinds of spaces. They allow for immediate feedback and conversations, two-way conversations, in a way that is more difficult in this environment. Because if we were in a room, I'm sure some of you would be going, Tom, you're full of crap, or I know Paul would, have you considered this, or why don't we look at this? So that's something that we're kind of missing right now, and that immediacy of being in the space in all forms, and that level of human contact. Communities of practice. Communities of practice are critical to the advance of any learning experience. They're simply easier to nurture and facilitate in an in-person environment, especially with students who are not well versed in forming them in the first place. I personally have experienced this. I remember I had one class. And the reason this class is so remarkable, and this class was, 14, 15 years ago now, where the students spontaneously all formed study groups and were talking to each other constantly and really pulled each other through the class. And this was taught in a much more traditional way. And I think half the students in that class got A's and B's. And that was an unusual grade. It was an unusual grade distribution for me. Certainly in those days, and it was all because they spontaneously formed those communities of practice. I always encourage it, but one of the problems of teaching at a commuter school where the students are coming and going is that they don't live together in the same way that a residential college environment allows for. So I'm convinced, by the way, that one of the reasons that these small private schools like the Philip Exeters of the world are so successful with their students is because you live and breathe school there. But that's all based on human contact. Unfortunately, these days, human contact brings with it the presence of germs and COVID, so that's a bit of a problem too. And then there's the performance aspect. It's harder to act on camera, to be honest, than it is on the stage. You may think the otherwise, but I've done both now a lot. So, okay, so the first tool here is the Instructor Whiteboard. And again, there's 4 different values. Oh yes, I didn't really go through the different numerical weights here. So there are 5, actually, there are 4 different axes here. There's the instructionalist, constructionist, sociocultural, and collaborative connections, how useful those are. A 0 on a particular tool says that tool effectively blocks the usage of that instructional method. There are relatively few zeros in the world, to be honest. If you're creative, you can figure it out. But one example would be a large lecture hall where everything is bolted to the floor, and then trying to do a constructionist approach to teaching in that room. It's possible. And as I said, some people would argue that that's a 0. Some people would say, no, I can make it work, in which case it would be a 1. Or a 1 or a 2, but it's not, but that's an example of that. So 1 is, the tool is largely irrelevant. In other words, it's there, but you never use it, right? When you're teaching this way. So having movable furniture, but always lecturing is an example of 1, right? The tool has to be adapted. So you may have tables that don't have wheels or they're hard to move, and moving that around, you have to be creative about how do you reuse those things. That's in the middle. 3, it sort of forces you down the pathway of approaching a particular approach to teaching and learning. And then finally, the tool absolutely requires that you teach this way. And again, 0s and 4s are fairly rare. Most tools fall into either 1, 2, or 3 categories. Getting back to the point that I'm not completely completely bought into creating a quantitative outcome to this in anything more than a heat map, because I realize there's an awful lot of interpretation involved here. But I think it's a useful way to sort of get an idea of, if I see a lot of directional in this direction or another, and again, part of this is stimulating conversation. So as you go through this tool, you can then, so this is Instructor Whiteboards. This is a big whiteboard in the front of the room. And so that would probably score, and I don't want to bias people here, so I'm not going to do a lot of this, but I'll do a little bit on the first one here. You might say, okay, it tends to be encouraging, it tend to be more encouraging for an instructionalist approach. It could be used as for a constructivist approach, so maybe a 1 or a 2 there. You just because you only have the one board in the front and it's a big board doesn't mean you can't have people come up and work on it in groups. It's just not as spontaneous as, say, having smaller boards scattered throughout the room, which is another option coming up. The sociocultural, I would say, is lower. Maybe I'll put a 2 here instead of a 1, and then do the problem with doing sociocultural is part of the idea is that that's a spontaneous interaction among the students, and if they feel that they're intimidated by having to go up to the board in order to have that spontaneous interaction, that tool doesn't necessarily, kind of tends to work against them, or is irrelevant because they use something else, right? Collaborationists, again, that's kind of a mixture between the tool too. So, and again, feel free to unmute and jump right in. And then last but not least, and again, I think this is very important, is, put it on a couple of sentences as to why you think this tool works better for this approach to teaching and learning versus other approaches. One of the things I would like to ultimately put into the guidebook is anecdotal things. Hey, we use this tool this way at our institution as a way of facilitating this kind of instruction, right? Because I have biases. I teach in environments, some of which I helped to create, some of which I didn't. I've taught in a lot of different environments over the years. They've colored my approach to things. And I have blind spots, and I freely acknowledge those blind spots as far as my interpretation of what works and what doesn't, right? So, okay, so that's the first one. Are people following along? Do I still have an audience? Looks like there's a couple of y'all who's still there. Run everybody off yet? This is the problem with teaching, wishing I had a bigger screen. Yep, okay. I did the gallery view on this, so I can see more than 1 or 2 people. Oops. What did I do there? Oh, I did. You can't see that. Okay, good. Yeah, this is one of the reasons that I've discovered when it comes to online teaching. You cannot teach Socratically with video conferencing. I walked into in the fall. I kind of, this is the first time I ever tried to teach with video conferencing. I've taught online before many times, but I've never really done synchronous online stuff in the way that I was doing. All my students are a bunch of little black boxes. Some cases I can't. You guys, I have faith that you're all still here at some level. But there were instances where I know they walked away and had their mic muted, the camera off, and went off and did something else because I ended the class and they were still there. So, okay. So are the questions at the page's bottom a quiz to make sure we understand the rest of the page, or or for our opinions of these points? So yeah, I kind of repeated this because this is all the same. Which questions at the bottom of the page? I'm not sure. Oh, you're talking about the survey parts. Yeah, so they're for you. I mean, no, this is not a test to see whether you get the concept. It's a survey to find out how you think these tools work, right? How they support what you're doing or not doing as you try to teach in different ways. Does that answer your question, Brian? Okay. Oh, that's Laura saying for your opinions and thoughts. Yes, please jump right in. The idea is that this last part is very much a conversation. Another question I have is that as a design project, you know, if you see things that are missing on the tool side, particularly, or something that I'm missing there, and I know there's tools that I have not included on this list. I've tried to. It's a war between how many different how far you're going to be prepared to drill down on tools. You know, there's a lot of different kinds of student whiteboards. There's a lot of different kinds of instructor whiteboards. So yes, if you have any thoughts as you're going through this, Ruben asked, should we discuss things in the chat? Yes, absolutely. If you want to put them in the chat, or you want to just pipe up, unmute. I think Laura, they can unmute, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So as you go through, I don't know. I guess should keep flipping through here. So we got student whiteboards. I just don't want to talk over anybody. Instructor projectors or displays. I think functionally speaking, whether it's a TV or projector is largely irrelevant. It's just a question of how accessible it is. And when I say instructor, that's a big screen at the front of the room, or even distributed screens that only show the instructor content, right? And then student projection. So the idea, so we have active learning classrooms based on the MIT, UNC, Wisconsin, not Wisconsin, Minnesota model, which I think you may have noticed, if you watch carefully, there was a picture of one of them that have individual screens, digital screens for the students that are hooked to pods. But there's a lot of different ways you can do that. And actually, I've kind of moved away from that kind of an approach, technologically speaking, to having something a little simpler and cheaper that's just a TV on a cart, flat screen on a cart with a connector for a laptop, with or without the laptop included, that allows the students to then wheel that over to wherever they happen to be working and have that ability to interact on the screen and do interactive things like interactive concept mapping and things like that, which are some really cool tools that open up when you have certain facilities. So there's different flavors of all of these things, and obviously some are going to push you in certain directions or others. But as it is, there are 40 different choices here. And this is not one of those 5-minute Survey Monkey kind of things. There's a certain commitment. I think most people will probably take anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour, depending on how much they write. Yeah, okay. I certainly should put that up front. Thanks, Allison, for that suggestion, that I should put that up front, that how long the expectation is that this take. And, I can also see doing this as a group. This is one thing that I'd love to, I've done this kind of thing somewhat with in-person groups back when we had in-person groups, but to have this survey, and going through that, have everybody going through that, sitting around a room discussing, oh, you know what, you say this works great, for this, but I don't think it works very well for this, or this tool works better. Maybe we, need to focus on this tool, kind of thing. I mean, this could be this was originally designed as a tool to have conversations with faculty as we were designing this new campus at Houston Community College. Yes. I mean, yes. And that's good, because I think this is an important conversation that rarely happens. Again, it's real easy to lump this stuff into buckets. This is all online. Well, not all online is created equal. A discussion board is not the same thing as a video conferencing tool. And I think we're a little more sensitive to that reality in learning spaces, although we've spent some time fighting our way toward that. I mean, I've certainly done a lot of work in that area, building the West Houston Institute and things like that, but also the flex space folks have done a huge amount of work in that area. And that's just that one part of the equation. What I'm trying to do is open it up and say, how does that fit into the larger equation of the technology? Doing it alone does make it feel like a test. Yes, unfortunately, if somebody has a better way of doing this in terms of doing it asynchronously, I'm all ears. But this is the best I've found so far. It's about, again, having that conversation. Variable size meeting spaces. These are still physical spaces. The idea, one of the things that I think hybrid campus is really going to need to have is the ability for professors to set up groups. Oh, sorry, Allison, that you have to leave. But the idea that professors will be able to reshape spaces for smaller groups. So maybe they only meet with part of their class in person at this particular time. For my online classes, I've divided them up into design groups, that'd be a good way to do too. I mean, this is a tool that anybody can use. It's open out there. So if you want to set up a group on your campus and work through it with them, or if you have a design project going, you want to hear from certain groups of people and get them to rethink the way that they're thinking about these spaces. That's the intent behind this tool as well. So it's a tool to use in and of itself, but it's also a tool where we can start to collect some information, I hope, to allow us to have some community resources as a mechanism for sharing. So variable size meeting spaces. A one-pager, you know what? Honestly, I don't think I have all 40. Well, yeah, actually I do. They're on the, if you look at the crazy diagram that's on the website, they're all there where I connect them up in sort of a rough draft form. So that diagram on the, here, let me go back to here. So they're here on this diagram, as well as on, now these diagrams are broken out into the 3 different sets, so they're a little bit shorter. The danger with these diagrams is that they were done about a month ago, so there may be 1 or 2 pieces missing. But if you go back to the home page, you will see this, which you can make big. That has all of them here broken out by the 3 different sets. Does that get you where you want to get to, Jay? Yeah, okay, good. If you need to, if you want, I can certainly break out a Word document list. I probably should do that anyway with the revised things that have come about as I've continued to refine this. At heart, I'm a designer. That means the problem with being a designer is the temptation to always tinker with stuff. So, but I'm also a project manager, so I also realize you have to stop at some point and say this is good, right? Yeah, so as far as Laura's question here, I wonder if we lose much meaningful conversation. Yes, it'll be interesting to see the answer to your question as far as sorting. And I'm hoping that at the end of the process, so that maybe we get, 50 to 100 responses, that we'll get to a certain point where we have a heat map. And that heat map might provide us some guidance for maybe a level 2 investigation of some of these groups of technologies, or ways to cluster technologies around generating certain kinds of conversations. Because rarely are these technologies used in isolation. That's the other thing to remember here. So, once we've built it down and we've looked at those individual Lego bricks, then we have to look at how do we build up the Lego house again. and how we reassemble the house using different bricks, right, this time around. So yeah, that sorting could happen, but I think that's a phase 2 event once we collect some more data. I can give you my opinion, but as I said, the purpose behind the survey is to get past my opinion and think about it from the perspective, a broader perspective, and get past my blind spots. So anyway, these are variable size meeting spaces where people can readjust the size of the space based on what their teaching needs, so they can meet with small groups of students, larger groups of students, and gives you a lot of flexibility about, as you adapt to the needs of your students in a hybrid environment. Do you need to have small group meetings, or do you need to get the whole class together? I mean, there's different times when you may need different things, even within the context of a base of a student, even within the context of a single class. Single-use science student-use science equipment, to what extent is that accessible? Can they play and do experiments? I know that probably scares the crap out of any of my scientist friends that may be in the audience, blowing up chemistry labs. But one thing we have now is increasingly the ability to simulate some of this stuff as well. But this is very much about getting your hands dirty. To what extent do the students have access to computing, whether they bring it themselves, but do you have the supplemental computing there, so that if they show up and they don't have a computer, you have some laptops in every room, so that that's always accessible, right? Or whatever devices you prefer to use. Now, then the second group of things are informal learning spaces. These are still physical spaces, but they're informal in nature. And so some of these repeat themselves, but they work differently in an informal environment. So having that student accessible display within an informal environment, to where the students can be using a large screen, that opens up certain possibilities, the unsupervised stuff, right? I remember a number of years ago, we built out a campus at HCC where the radical experiment was putting whiteboards out in the student areas. And of course, there was always the comment that somebody's going to draw a giant penis on it or something like that. And I never saw that happen. The most subversive things I saw on there was things people writing things like "why?" ? Or something like that. Yes, the second life problem. Yes, exactly. But surprisingly enough, the vast majority, they were heavily used, and they were used very productively in those spaces. And as a matter of fact, in some spaces, they actually took them down because the students were too noisy, because they were working, right? And it wasn't that they were cutting up, but they were working an engineering problem. And then the places in the adjacent classrooms were complaining because the noise was going through the too thin walls in those cases. So those are also considerations. So those are larger design considerations. But I found those to be very productive. But having displays kind of takes that to a new level as well. Ubiquitous computing, having computing just sort of scattered throughout the building where people can walk up at any point and access that. Again, this is the ILS stuff, is informal learning spaces. That's what that is. Student whiteboards, again, in that informal space. Mobile furniture, to the students able to rearrange those spaces on their own to accommodate certain kinds of different size groups. I talk about this in considerable detail in the stack model article that's coming out next week. Faculty, do you have faculty consultation spaces for those faculty who may not have an office on that particular campus, to where you can quickly pull a student aside or pull a student into a room and have a talk about something they're concerned about. If you, again, the adjunctification, something Brian likes to talk about a lot, also often means those adjuncts do not have offices. So where do you meet with those students when you need to have that conversation that you don't necessarily want to share with the whole world? One of the things I found was, a number of years ago, we used to have these nice little study rooms in the library with glass windows and everything. And this was at one of our older campuses, and they remodeled the libraries and took those out. But as I remember my early days as an adjunct, those were my offices. Those were the places I could meet with students. And they were essential to the way, being able to interact with those students. And then there's a people equation to this. You know, those support services act as tools in and of themselves. And so how accessible are those support services? Do you have the libraries, tutoring, counseling, you know, for the emotional side of things, because that's important to the learning process too. Do you have a design group like a makerspace or design space approximate to that informal learning space? Again, those can create a lot of opportunities. Again, I go through a lot of that. Oh yes, here's Brian right now. This is those of you. Brian has a session of the his forum, Future Trends Forum this afternoon. So if you haven't heard enough from us at the end of this, starting in an hour and a half after this ends, he'll have a session. I should hopefully be there. But, you know, think about those virtual tool sets. And so Brian's made excellent use of the Shindig platform. Again, one of many virtual environments, video conferencing environments. And you can see some of the features of that here. Thursday double feature, yes. And so, you know, learning management systems. And our learning management systems are boxes of tools. So you can't just say a learning management system, certainly not anymore. So quizzes, you know, how do you use the quizzes? What kind of pedagogical strategies does the quiz tool most support? And I'm talking generically. As in this section, by the way, if you note, I always ask at the beginning here for which system we're talking about. Because one of the things with virtual environments is that they're very easy to manipulate in some ways, and even from version to version, in a way that a physical room isn't. So what may be true of a virtual environment one day could change the very next if they do an update. But also there's differences in the way that these tools work, even though they may be called quizzes in both Blackboard or Canvas or Desire to Learn or whichever one you happen to use, Sakai, Moodle, etc. That may affect how you can use them. That have a lot of times subtle differences can make a big difference here. So in this section, I am asking you to identify which LMS you're looking at, and if you happen to use one at your institution, obviously. Obviously, that's going to create a spread of scatter diagrams, because you may discover that Canvas is really good at doing this, and Blackboard is really good at doing that. Also, from the perspective of, you know, as you're designing, if you're designing these systems, if you're a developer, and you could theoretically look at this data and say, you know what, we really need to tweak this tool in this way, and we can make it much more useful for this kind of pedagogical approach. And again, I don't think we're getting to a point now where that kind of rich interaction can happen within LMSs, to where there can be a qualitative difference between one platform's test tool and another platform's test tool, or the student communications available in those tools, right? So this is, again, a tool that they could use to look at connecting that up. They may have their own tools, but submissions, you know, in a broader sense, what kind of ways you can turn things in. Graded discussions. All of these are things that exist within various LMSs, and I'm sure there's some, again, that I missed. Again, once you get into the digital world, the universe of possible tools gets larger, because it's easy to say, okay, well, let's try this new thing, right? I try to focus on things that I think are qualitatively different from one another. So discussions here, the conference tool, in Canvas, that's the video conference tool inside the LMS. Content tools, so it's like concept mapping and things like that, which I think the LMSs, all of the LMSs I've seen have to have some work to do there. Let's put it that way. Then there's a second category here, which I call the web tools. These are outside the LMS primarily, although they may in some cases be integrated or integratable, but they're their own platforms. So this is an example of one, the Zoom platform again, which I think some of you may be familiar with because you're looking at it right now. public blogs, one example, WordPress, for instance, if you have your students use that, right? I have in the past, I've kind of moved everything inside of Canvas this semester, but in past semesters, I've used a public blog instead of Canvas because it's easier for them to have a group environment there, right? Thanks, Brian. See you in a while. Concept mapping tools. Things like MindMeister or Draw.io. I use Draw.io for this in my classes. I like using MindNode myself just because it's quick and dirty on my own computer, but it's local. So it's not really a web tool. Drawing tools, Illustrator, that sort of thing. Again, identify which one you're doing and which ways you could theoretically think about using those to support different kinds of pedagogical style. Image editing tools, Photoshop, that sort of universe of tool sets. Coding tools. So if you use coding within your class, and there are a number of different platforms that allow you to do everything from object-oriented programming to hard coding. I assume there's still assembler tools out there. I once, for about 20 minutes back in the early 80s, actually attempted to do some assembly language and then quickly switched back to basic because it made my head explode. Google tools. So I kind of go with Google here because they're freely available. But obviously the Microsoft shared tools, which are not necessarily as open and freely available, could be used in similar ways collaboratively. But I mean, there's something to be said for being out on the public web. So I talk about, Google Drive. I have Google Drive on here, Google Docs. Maybe I'm getting a little too specific here. I've got Sheets as well. Slides, the Google Suite. Video services, and what I'm talking about here are platforms that could be something like Kaltura or YouTube, where you can upload content that hosts that video content that allows you to then share that within the class. And that's another example. Then there's the online textbook sites, and they create their own environments. And again, I'm asking you to identify here really. Publishers probably good enough because a lot of times their platforms stretch across multiple textbooks, but they're using the same underlying systems if they're smart about it. But yeah, so online, the advantages of an online textbook for different kinds of things. I mean, I've been fighting with that this week because the online textbook that we're using right now, I want to be able to put individualized chapters and organize the narrative in my class so that the workflow dictates the flow of the students through the class. But since the textbook that I happen to be using won't let me do anything other than take them to the textbook as a whole, I can't put the individual chapters where they fit. And so I have to go through some bunch of arcane ways of re-navigating the students back to where they should be in the flow of things. So that's kind of a little frustration, personal frustration I have this week. I've left 3 spaces for video conferencing. One of the things that's become very clear to me is that you can have very different experiences in video conferencing as much as you can within a given classroom. And so some video conference platforms are the equivalent of chairs bolted to the floor. Other video conference platforms are the equivalent of everybody being forced to sit in a circle around a campfire. And other video conference platforms allow you to move between multiple modalities quickly and easily. So I know a lot of people use multiple platforms at various levels of what they're trying to do. I work in the last few weeks, I've been in Zoom, WebEx, Kaltura, and Microsoft Teams. And they're all within the context of working on stuff at my institution. depending on who's meeting, who's running the meeting, you end up with different tools. And they're very different experiences in many cases. So I've left 3 slots here for different video conferencing tools. By the way, you can skip over any of these. You're not required to fill out every piece. And so that's something else, that kind of mitigates against the length of it a little bit, is that you can skip over whole chunks. You know what, I'm going to focus on the digital tools and just give feedback there. That's fine. Okay. Last but not least here, I think Hypothesis is an interesting platform because it kind of changes. It works differently than Google Docs in many ways. And it's an annotation platform for those of you who may not be familiar with it. And I think it creates some different kinds of learning modalities as a result of that. So I've stuck it in here in its own little special place for that reason. And last but not least, the XR tool sets. Now I've again gone a little bit differently in this direction. So by the way, there's a really funny thing. I went out and looked for open source images, and some of you may know Alan from way back when in the NMC days, but I searched for AR pictures that were open source, and one of the first ones that came up was this picture that Alan took back in, I think, 2010. So lest you think this is new, it's really been around in many ways for quite a while, at an NMC conference, actually, long time ago. So what's old is new. So augmented reality experiences. And so what I've done here is, instead of doing the tool values, because honestly, I have, I can give you, Marilyn, I can give you some people to talk to there that are definitely a lot more knowledgeable about Hypothesis than I am. I just haven't had a chance to explore it very thoroughly. But if you notice, these sections are a little bit different because I don't think we have enough practical experience to really value them in the same way as the others. I think that will change fairly quickly. I also think that COVID might actually be probably will be an accelerator on this as well. But I just don't know how fast this is kind of pushing the boundaries of some people's imagination. So I've kind of left this as a long form only, and allowed people to say, okay, for the purposes of augmented reality specifically. So that's, Google Glass is the grandfather there, but even just using your phone to play Pokemon Go or something like that, or the various iterations of that, those are all examples of augmented reality. Fully immersive environments, that usually involves goggles of some sort. And then, if you have personal experience with this, I want to hear from you, absolutely, because I definitely think this needs to start folding its way into this discussion. Immersive problem solving. One of the coolest things I've seen in the last 6 months is, and now I've totally zoned on the name of the tool. I'm big into concept mapping and mind mapping as a way of breaking apart ideas. And I saw a VR mind mapping tool, which I was like, okay, now that's something I would get into a room about. Actually, this goes way back in the early days when we all used to be in Second Life. Sun developed a platform called Wonderland, which was designed to be a server hostable, a server. If somebody can remember the name of that VR concept mapping tool, I have it somewhere, and it's totally eluding me at the moment. But Sun had the Wonderland platform, and they did a thing that looked like virtual. Yeah, Noda, I think that's what it is. Yeah, that sounds right. Noda.com. And they did a VR experience that had sort of a concept mapping feel, and that sort of made my light bulb go off. And that was 12, 13 years ago or more. And so that's it. And hopefully, I know that was kind of a breakneck, and I was hoping to get a little bit more back and forth on that, but hopefully you guys are busily Moda.io. My apologies, John. But yeah, you can't assume everything's .com anymore, I know. But feedback, questions, thoughts? We got a few minutes here. couple of minutes before we run out of time. As expected, because of the tool, I ended up doing much more of the talking than I wanted to. Not for lack of trying.
Well, I'm curious in the last couple minutes if there are any tools that people in the room have found particularly useful for the way that they want to teach right now, or even the way they want to learn right now.
Yes, Jenna, we could go to the Slack channel. Which neighborhood? Yeah, I tend to, when it comes to video conferencing, I definitely tend to go to Zoom because it's flatter. And the things that I tend to want to do, especially when I'm teaching, but is that to me, the part that's the hardest to replicate is that interaction. And my classes were already very much, my classrooms, if you walked by my classrooms when we had physical classrooms, you would see me sitting at the table with the students more often than not, because I would set up a basic scaffolding, but then it was all about listening to where they were struggling and then making suggestions and interacting with them in that way. Zoom comes closest to that in terms of the way it works. But I still have the black box problem, you know, because I can't see people, right? Yeah, we can do it in humanizing learning. Although we'll have to bug out here eventually. Other questions, thoughts, tools, as Laura suggested? Please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm on Twitter at ideaspaces net and Tom at ideaspaces.net. If you want to email me, or I do occasionally throw stuff out onto Twitter. These days I've been putting more photography up because I've decided I don't want to drive traffic to Mark Zuckerberg's platform. So, but yes, this is the beginning of the process. It's certainly not the end. And oh, that's background noise. I heard a voice, but it's coming from downstairs. The pleasures of a home office. So
Indeed. Well, thank you so much, Tom. This has been fascinating, and I can't wait to see where we collectively and with your leadership take it over the next hours, days, weeks, months. Real quick friendly reminder that you are all invited to the Learning Man Summer Camp taking place in the end of July. It's free to register. We'll have a whole bunch of interesting sessions all around student-centered everything and crafting the future of learning that we want to see. So thank you so much for joining us. I hope to see you in Slack. Be sure to reach out if you have any difficulties accessing the Slack channel, and we will see you next time. Thank you, everyone.
thanks for coming.